One of the greater absurdities of the pandemic era isn't just how we told everyone to stay home, restricting what they could or couldn't do in public places. It's how we restricted what they could do with their own homes too, actually, as in what a property owner can do with his property. For over a year, federally, removing a landlord's right to evict a bad tenant. In fact, in some of the more communistically inclined places in the country, the eviction ban was still in place until earlier this year. In San Francisco, it's still active, actually. You still can't evict for non-payment, at least. Of course, this was all done on the premise of helping good people who were down on their luck. We can't evict people who lose their jobs in the middle of an emergency in which they'll have trouble finding a new one. In theory, that all sounds kind and charitable. In practice, though, it led to mass abuses because we incentivized and protected bad behavior. Tenants just stopped paying because they didn't have to, and government programs that were supposed to offset those losses by compensating landlords were ineffectively managed. And so very often, landlords were left to see their property destroyed and their income severed, with no legal right to remove bad actors for months on end, sometimes years. Oh, well, it serves them right, though, we'll sometimes hear. Oh, those poor monopoly men. I guess they'll have to wait until next year to buy a new suit and top hat. The thing is, though, most of the country's landlords are not monopoly men, as in big business operations. Not that it would change their property rights, even if they were. But most of the country's landlords are individual investors. In other words, that neighbor family of yours that owns a property or two, that provides for their family with the rental income. So as much as we were supposed to think that we were helping families with this move, we really weren't, because for every family that we supposedly helped, we harmed another. And even those families that we were supposedly helping, we really weren't. We didn't protect vulnerable tenants from predatory landlords. We just prolonged the inevitable. Bad tenants are bad tenants, so when government protection for them ends, the issue corrects itself. And the data show it. Across the country, as pandemic-era eviction bans have expired, evictions are now spiking to levels 50% higher than before we started all this nonsense. In some cities, over double the pre-pandemic rate. Now, is this a demonstration of evil landlords finally having their way, or is this a demonstration of bad tenants finally facing justice? Well, consider how these decisions are made. It's by court adjudication, not by the boot of the landlord, which would suggest these are not numbers reflective of just good faith tenants trying to meet their obligations but having a tough time. These are tenants who have prolonged the legal process to the maximum possible extent, so much so that even often sympathetic judges in left-wing cities can no longer protect them. But you would think, now that government has ended its interventionist policy, that would be an end to the insanity. And in many ways it is, at least insofar as evictions are now possible, but nothing prolongs the possible like government facilitation. And while the government is no longer a blockade, its necessary assistance in the matter is still making evictions a months or even years-long process for many. What makes eviction such a long, drawn-out process legally is that it's generally a civil matter, not a criminal one. The landlord has a tenant. The landlord and the tenant have some sort of dispute about the terms of their agreement. That's not a crime. That is a civil dispute for the courts to handle and reach a resolution. But that's not just the case in landlord-tenant disputes, as in when the two parties have an agreement ahead of time. It's also often the case in landlord-squatter disputes too, as in when people enter the property without any authorization in the first place. In many circumstances, even that is not a criminal matter. That is still a drawn-out civil matter to resolve, drawn out even more now by the backlog of eviction proceedings to complete, since we banned them for so long. So this eviction issue is still a national problem. Evictions are legal, but the process to get bad tenants out is still lengthy and arduous. And that is how we reach the final form of the ironies here, because of course, it's not ironic enough to protect vulnerable tenants to enable them to destroy property. It's not ironic enough to ban evictions only to concentrate them in the same volumes later. Modern times demand we need more backward. We need more upside down. And so, of course, the final form of the irony is a landlord getting arrested for investigating unauthorized presence on his property. The situation is much like retail theft or threats on the subway or other forms of crime now rampant, where the police and the courts won't resolve the crime for the victim is left to resolve the crime for himself, and then our backward legal system makes him the criminal for defending his own rights. That is exactly what happened to Tom Arco, a homeowner in Decatur, Georgia, east of Atlanta. In February, he had a prior renter leave, and so he visited his property in preparation for shopping for new tenants, and he was surprised to learn there were already new tenants there, and he had no idea who these people were. And before he could even ask, he was greeted with a gun barrel.
He showed up to find someone had broken in. He says as soon as he pulled into the driveway, a gun was pointed at him.
I just jumped the fence and ran. I didn't know what else to do.
And much like discussed earlier, this group inside his home was not some good faith family sitting around the table with a calculator just trying to make ends meet. This was something of an involved criminal operation.
I didn't walk in on a family eating dinner. I walked in on weapons, a prostitute, a bunch of dogs in the back, my fence broken down.
So, naturally, Tom called the police. And then he got arrested for trespassing.
But it was Arco police took into custody that day back in February after he called 911.
And they told the police that I was a home invader and that it was their home. And so I ended up being arrested and detained.
Okay, but that had to be just confusion in the moment, right? These squatters tell police it's their place. This possible home invader tells police it's his. So police make a preliminary arrest before they look up the records and sort all of this out. And then the bad guys got arrested, right? No. In fact, the bad guys still live there today, actually, 6 months later. So this reporter inquired, and one of the squatters insists to him they live there on legal terms.
How is that a lie?
That's a lie.
Are you not a squatter? One of the alleged squatters at Arco's home yelled at us while we were in front of the home shooting video that he is no squatter. You didn't break into this home?
Oh, no, sir.
Did somebody break into this house?
No, nobody broke in this house.
Well, this should be a very easy matter to resolve then. Say, do you have any documentation to show your legal presence?
Do you have a lease?
Yes, I do. That's a lie.
Can you show me the lease?
I don't have to show you that.
What exactly is going on in there? Nobody apparently knows. But in addition to the arrest, Tom Arco, this homeowner, is now liable for code citations too, for not properly maintaining the property, even though he can't legally access the property. Unclear if those code violations have anything to do with the 2 dead bodies found in the home since. Reportedly, there have been 2 fatal drug overdoses in the home during this 6-month squatter party as well. Now, how all of that is possible is explained by the prior point. Despite the unauthorized presence, despite the lack of a contract with the property owner, despite the gun pointed, despite the prostitution, despite the drug use, despite the dead bodies, this is still not a criminal matter. It's a civil one, and the court to settle this civil dispute is bogged down. So it took months of court battle for Arco to get this eviction order, which he has finally recently obtained, but of course, he's not within his rights to enforce it himself. He needs marshals to do that, and they have a very busy schedule too. The beginning of September looks pretty good for an eviction, they say, though, but until then, the months-long drug and hooker party at Tom's house rages on. How this insanity remains a civil dispute, despite all the criminality involved, remains a mystery to me. In related reporting on how this is becoming a national problem, I see description that squatting itself is generally not a crime, only trespass is, and it's usually police discretion to decide the difference. Okay, but set aside even the obvious criminality of the gun pointing and the prostitution and the drug use, remove all of these secondary factors. How is this not criminal at its core? First of all, it is trespassing in the form of unauthorized presence on private property despite warning otherwise, but it's also theft in the form of not just the physical occupation of this homeowner's property, but it's theft in the form of robbing his opportunity to earn income from it as well. If these same people occupied this landlord's car with hookers and blow and then pointed a gun at him as he approached to investigate, police would remove them and arrest them on the spot. So why is the home any different? And even if the home is legally different because it's a dwelling and people have certain rights within dwellings that they don't within cars, fine, but then on what plausible basis could the homeowner be arrested for trespass, but not the squatters? He shows up at his own home and he gets cuffed. They show up at his home and they get rent-free accommodation for the better part of a year. That is not explained by some civil criminal distinction in the law. That is explained only by the lunacy of a police force that protects criminals and punishes a law-abiding property owner. And unfortunately for this guy, it seems he's way too polite and understanding to do much of anything about it. In the meantime, at the end of the story, he's still willing to at least entertain the possibility that these people are in his property on innocent terms, that perhaps there's some sort of misunderstanding to explain their presence.
I feel like it's very heavily weighted towards these were trespassers and criminals, not people that got duped.
Yeah, I'd say the gun pointed at your face and the dead bodies behind it are a pretty good indicator. Though I get it, he's a good faith guy trying to resolve what is an incredibly bad faith conflict. The reality is, amicable negotiation won't resolve conflict with abusive criminals. Only superior force will. And I think he knows that. He's just trying to be a good guy in his public presentation. But fair's fair. If these criminals take this property by dogs and guns, well then dogs and guns are justified force in response to take it back, either by the police force or by this property owner himself. It's either that or a hooker cage match, but I'm guessing this guy is way too clean to have any combat-trained hooker fighters ready for deployment. Thanks as always for listening and for supporting this channel. Always appreciate that thoughtful discussion down below and especially over on Gab. That is at ML Christiansen. You're always welcome to coming out and chatting my live streams. Those are linked down in the description. Looking forward to it. Goodbye.